As the Denver Broncos approach their final week of the 2022 NFL season, all reports suggest that they are going to swing big for their next potential head coach. We take a look at guys like Jim Harbaugh, Sean Payton, Dan Quinn. What makes sense and what might the Broncos do? Plus, what is going on with the offensive line? We take a look at where the offensive line is struggling, and we take a look at what we think the Broncos will do this offseason. You get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much, everybody in Broncos country, for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you watch us on YouTube. You can catch us on your smartphone, your TV, even your computer on YouTube. Make sure you hit that comment or that like button. Make sure you follow and subscribe so you never miss a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody, Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and good friend, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, my friend, look, things are heating up in the final week of the season here for this Broncos football team as they prepare to close out the season at home against the Los Angeles Chargers this upcoming Sunday. Kickoff time, more likely probably around that 2:05, 2:25 p.m. Mountain Time kick. We'll still wait to get official word on that. No Saturday game for Denver here this week. That was something everybody in Broncos country was waiting to see. But we'll dive into more of the preview matchup stuff of the Chargers a little bit later on this week. However, there's some big news surrounding this Broncos football team as it pertains to what they may do with their next head coach and what the search will entail. And all reports suggest the Broncos, they're going to get up to plate and they're going to swing big, my friend. And there's obviously three names that are very intriguing, with Sean Payton, Jim Harbaugh, and Dan Quinn potentially being the frontrunners for the job that Denver is looking to hire.
Very interesting indeed. All these reports about these coach candidates came out on Sunday, right? So starting Sunday morning, Adam Schefter, he reported that, you know how, Cody, a lot of fans get upset about reporters spoiling NFL draft picks or NBA draft picks. So they complained enough, and these reporters now have changed. Like, I know Woj for the NBA, he'll be like, such and such is really strongly considering targeting such and such in the draft. Adam Schefter kind of had a similar type of thing when he talked about Sean Payton and the Broncos. He was like, the expectation from people is a long-winded way for him to basically say, like, Sean Payton could be the top target, and the Broncos are at least going to make sure that they get a conversation with him. And then it was later reported by Tom Pelissero that, and I think this is a good point to note for anybody that's listening, just to know there's going to be a process for any NFL team that wants to hire Sean Payton. Not only do you have to get permission from the New Orleans Saints to even talk to him, but you also have to know that Sean Payton is interested in your job. And on top of that, you got to pay him a contract. On top of that, it was reported by Schefter and Pelissero that the compensation to acquire Sean Payton in a trade, because he is under contract. It's not like he's a coaching free agent, right? He's under contract with the Saints. He retired last year. So if you want to talk to him, you got to get permission. If you want to talk to him, you got to have mutual interest from the other side. He's got to want to talk to you. Also, you got to pay him a big contract. This discussion is going to start and end with a lot of money. But also, you have to give the New Orleans Saints, likely, according to Schefter, a first-round pick, potentially more than that. So Pelissero said the compensation is expected to be significant. So I think if you're a Broncos fan out there and Sean Payton is your top target, you believe he's the best head coach candidate available to this team in 2023, well, it's going to cost a lot to get him, and not just financially. It will require the Broncos' first-round pick, probably the one that they've got here in 2023 from the San Francisco 49ers, obviously through the Bradley Chubb trade with the Dolphins.
Well, and it even goes back to mentioning as well that the Walton Penner family ownership group is expected to be very aggressive, and that they are willing to go all in to do that, which I feel like the term all in, right? It makes you excited. Like, if you're a fan, you're excited. Like, okay, hey, they're willing to do whatever it takes. at the same time, that all-in approach, I think you have to weigh every single pro and con for that, right? You mentioned Sean Payton. To me, I think the con would be giving up that first-round pick. You may have to give up some personnel say, so to speak, on that. Compensation. Is he interested? As you mentioned, I think that's a fantastic point that you pointed out there. We don't know that, right? Because there's been some talk that he's not really as interested in Denver as maybe Denver might be as interested in him, but I think that there is a conversation to be had between the Walton Penner family ownership group and Sean Payton. We'll see how that goes there. But let's go to the next one here. Jim Harbaugh, obviously the Michigan head coach. They lost in the college football playoffs to TCU this past weekend. There's some ties there, right? We talked about Condoleeza Rice, who's going to be heavily associated in this head coaching search. The cost to buy him out at Michigan is $3 million. But the question is Jim Harbaugh interested in coming back to the NFL? Which I will say maybe there is some interest because last year he interviewed with the Minnesota Vikings. In my opinion, I've been on the record. I said this, I think, last week. Jim Harbaugh is the wild card sleeper coach here in this situation for how he likes to operate. And I know that there are a lot of fans that watch the Michigan game like, time management. He did a horrible job in the game against TCU. Like, we can't let these things ruin the bigger picture perspective when it comes to the head coaching candidates. So there is that with Jim Harbaugh. And obviously, not to mention, there is Dan Quinn in Dallas, who his Cowboys right now, they're gearing up for a playoff run.
They are, and it'll be fascinating to see how they finish the season, how, if they continue to go deep in the playoffs, how that affects potentially his candidacy for other jobs, whether it's Denver or somebody else. Cody, just to vamp off the Jim Harbaugh thing for a second here, there's a reason why his buyout at Michigan, despite the number of times that they've talked about renewing his deal and giving him a contract extension, I think there's a reason why his buyout is a very palatable $3 million. Because I think at any point, if he decided to go to the NFL, that's probably something he and Michigan have talked about for a long time. And he's given them a lot of really, really great years as a coach. He has done pretty much everything he probably set out to do there, short of winning a national title. Beating Ohio State was maybe better than that for him. So I think that for Jim Harbaugh, we know he wants to win a Super Bowl in the NFL. We know he got really close with the 49ers the year the Broncos should have won the Super Bowl back in the 2012 season. So I think he does want to go back to the NFL. I don't think he talks to the Vikings last year if he's not seriously interested. And that report about Harbaugh being reached out to by the Denver Broncos came from Pro Football Talk's Mike Florio, who, for all his faults and for all his hot takes through the years, he is well connected to George Payton. So that's an interesting report nonetheless. I mean, just to consider the source there. So certainly some things heating up in terms of this Broncos coaching rumor mill.
And we'll see, these are like the top three candidates right now that are deemed as like, okay, hey, the Broncos want to swing big for these guys. Obviously, you hope that they cast a little bit of a wider net in the search, and there's going to be some young names, some potential first-year head coaches, again, which I know for many people in Broncos country is kind of like a red flag. They're like, hey, I'm scared to get burnt again, because of this, and rightfully so. That is a very valid feeling that they have, considering that Denver's last three head coaches were all first-year head coaches, and they simply have not panned out in dramatic fashion. Obviously, Broncos country, we want to know your thoughts down below. If you're watching on YouTube, comment down below your thoughts on the Broncos head coaching search, who you would like to see them take a swing at in the top three. Is there a name that we missed that you're really saying, hey, they should look at this guy? Let us know down below, or tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. One of the things we're going to talk about in today's episode of the show is the offensive line. What is going on with it? Why has Russell Wilson been sacked so many times? You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports done right, and with the Prize Picks app, you choose 2 to 5 players that you're focused on heading into the week. These players, they'll have a projection that's set by Prize Picks, and you simply choose whether or not they will have more or less than their Prize Picks projection, which could allow you to win 10 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks is going to give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks is going to give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. What is the issue with the Broncos' offensive line this season? Outside of injuries, execution, a changing of the scheme, there are a lot of questions to be had about what's happened to the offensive line this season, in particular with Russell Wilson getting sacked as many times as he has, but also gives us an idea as to what could the Broncos do going into next year. Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day in your favorite audio podcasting platform. Wherever you get your podcast, this show is available for you free there, or you can watch us on YouTube. We appreciate you so much, everybody in Broncos Country. Sayre, my friend, let's talk about the offensive line. Now, this is kind of like a twofer on today's episode of the show. We're going to talk about it here. We're going to talk about it in the next segment as well, in kind of two different portions here. In my opinion, looking back at this offensive line, right, when Russell Wilson was traded to Denver, we all thought, okay, hey, looking at it on paper, Denver's got a better offensive line than maybe Russell Wilson has had in Seattle. On the contrary, that has been quite the opposite narrative so far this season. Now, granted, there have been some injuries. We'll talk about that. Obviously, Lloyd Cushenberry done for the year on IR. He didn't play well this year anyways when he was in there. You have Garrett Bowles, who you lost in Week 5 at left tackle. You had Billy Turner, who you signed in the offseason, that was really only able to make his debut Week 6 against the Los Angeles Chargers, and then had another injury that put him out on the shelf for a little bit of time. And then, now he's back to finish out the season in these final 2 games. Well, now final 1 game he played against Kansas City, obviously. But it's just like there's just been so much change on this offensive line, and it has not panned out the way it has. Russell Wilson's been sacked 53 times there. 53 times is the most he's ever been sacked in his career. Granted, he's missed 2 games, and there's 1 game remaining against a very aggressive Chargers defense that does have Joey Bosa back alongside opposite of Khalil Mack. In my opinion, something went wrong with this offensive line. Now, granted, I think it's important that we put it out there. Some of the sacks that Russell Wilson has taken have been on him for simply holding the ball too long. But outside of that, you've seen it with the offensive line not being able to get pushed in the run game, and also in pass protection. The offensive line has been an issue this season.
It has. And like you mentioned, have we even really seen the scheme that we were promised? And we talked about that right after Nathaniel Hackett was fired. It was kind of like we never really saw. Remember, he wanted to see the old John Elway to Ed McCaffrey long bombs and Rod Smith long bombs and things off a play action boot. And we just never saw the run game that sets those things up. We never we haven't. We didn't see that with him and Butch Berry. And I think that's a big reason why Butch Berry was let go by Jerry Rosburg. And we heard Jerry Rosburg kind of allude to the fact that maybe certain things in terms of the player personnel were reasons why he let Butch Berry go. But I mean, we never know the full story there, but I think we can kind of see based on what we've seen during the games, based on what we've seen during the season in terms of like the roster shuffling and the personnel, like why did Calvin Anderson all of a sudden get pulled from his starting left tackle position when he was showing some decent things and maybe could be an option for you in the future? Tom Compton, we haven't seen him all year. You let Netani Muti go. He goes to sign with the Raiders practice squad. Remember during the preseason and training camp, Cody, you and I were talking about how the Broncos kind of have like 10 or 11 starting caliber or at least NFL caliber offensive linemen on the roster. And that wasn't even including Luke Wattenberg at the time, who you add him to the mix and you figure, well, the team traded up for him, so he must have some nice upside and potential. And now here we are. The war on attrition has absolutely killed the Denver Broncos on the offensive line, and they just haven't quite been able to figure anything out. And we saw the game against the Chiefs on Sunday. That ended. Remember, Quinn Bailey had to take over for Dalton Reisner at an injury at the left guard position, which we've seen a couple times here in 2022. And it's now 2023, I suppose. But man, you've seen all these different sorts of things go on, and the Broncos haven't been able to recover. I think that you could point to some positives, some glimmers of hope. Like I know there's some analytics out there that say Cam Fleming has actually done a pretty good job in the run game. And, Graham Glasgow, he's done pretty good at center. I just don't know. I don't know how to properly evaluate offensive line play, Cody. I don't know all their assignments. I don't know what they're being coached to do. All I can, determine is based off the eye test. Is the run game playing well? Is the pass protection consistently good, or is it consistently pretty good? I mean, those are the ways that I evaluate offensive line play. And I would say for the most part this season, even with injuries considered, that the Broncos offensive line just hasn't been good enough at all.
Yeah, and I think there's so many things to kind of factor in, right? We talked about injuries. It's an unfortunate nature. It's an unfortunate part of the game. I do feel like Graham Glasgow's done a really solid job at the center position, right? We haven't really seen any low snaps, high snaps. out to the right, out to the left that we did see with Lloyd Cushenberry. And to be honest with you, Graham Glasgow is stronger. There's some things, and obviously we'll talk about in the next segment coming up, it's like what the Broncos should do and what we think they will do on the offensive line. In my opinion, Cam Fleming's not a very strong option at tackle. You know, as you mentioned, the run blocking, that is a benefit that he did have there. He had a great block that helped seal and spring Russell Wilson free on a 16-yard touchdown against the Chiefs. But in pass protection, he's just widely inconsistent, right? And you can't have that, especially for a quarterback that's been sacked as many times as Russell Wilson, and especially when you play in a division and now the NFL that's transitioned to speed and highly athletic edge rushers off the outside. You have to have consistency there. You have to have offensive tackles that are athletic. Billy Turner, actually, I would say, like for the most part, has been a pretty solid option at right tackle. The biggest question you're going to get with him, though, is health. How does that impact things in the long run for this Broncos football team? I think there's a lot of things we'll have to ponder, and we'll talk about that on today's episode of Locked On Broncos as to what the Broncos need most on the offensive line in 2023. Also, what do we think they will do? We'll dive into that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at BetOnline.net. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from pro football to college bowl season to basketball and World Cup. We've got it all at betonline.net. If you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline as well. We're always the fastest and the easiest way to get your betting info, so head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. What do the Broncos need most on the offensive line going into the 2023 NFL season? We take a look at our offseason wish list. We also take a look at what we think the Broncos will do. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much. We have you covered literally every single day all year long. As we approach the offseason, we want to make one thing very clear. For the true fan, there is never an offseason. We'll have you covered on your favorite audio podcasting platform or YouTube every step of the way as we get close to free agency, as we get close to the NFL draft, OTAs, training camp, and then back for the season once again. It comes by pretty quickly there, Broncos country. So make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. What do the Broncos need most on the offensive line, sir? I mean, I feel like this is kind of a loaded question, right? Because when you look at it, there's a multitude of things that Denver needs. I think more importantly, I think for Russell Wilson's strengths and what could, I think, protect him ultimately in the end game, athletic offensive tackles. Now, I think a big question, look, Garrett Bowles, in my opinion, is going to be back with Broncos, Quinn Miners. Those are the two offensive linemen right now that are starting that I believe are guaranteed back in 2023. The question for Garrett is, can he maintain his athleticism after suffering such a grueling leg injury? Obviously, the broken leg that he had to have surgically repaired. Is that going to be there? Is there going to be a little bit of a drop-off because he's trying to get used to being back and doing his normal kick step and having to plant and move and things like that? To me, I think there's a lot of questions about that, especially when you have a player coming off of a major injury. I wanted to ask a question, Sayre. Even though that you have questions about his injury history and the frequency in which he stays healthy, if you're the Broncos, because right now in free agency at right tackle, Sayre, there is nobody that is going to come in and be a difference maker for the Broncos at right tackle. Do you consider keeping Billy Turner again, maybe signing him to a one-year deal? Because I think in pass protection and in the run game, when healthy, I feel like Billy Turner's actually been pretty solid. Is that a risk you're willing to take, considering that Denver has a late round one pick, which they could eventually trade if they really want to get Sean Payton as their head coach and there's mutual interest? In my opinion, I think you have to look at this as a potential option for Denver.
I think you do too. I really do. And I'm not saying that you build this budget-friendly patchwork offensive line that, you have so many more question marks after the offseason than you did going in. But I completely agree with you, Cody. You have to be able to make, calculated risk moves. When you're talking about somebody like Billy Turner, who does play well when he's healthy, it's a worthwhile risk to take to say, hey, we'll bring you back for a reasonable price and give you the opportunity to start for us again and take that risk on him staying healthy. Does that mean that you then don't invest in the draft or in free agency otherwise besides Billy Turner? I don't think so. Look, like Broncos fans, a lot of times, like the NFL draft discussion on Twitter is kind of kind of like this these days, right? Because it's like it starts and ends with offensive line for most people. They're like offensive line with all 6 picks. I don't care what else. That's not going to happen, okay? And it may not even happen with their first pick. And I think that people need to kind of come to grips with that. Cody, remember when the Chiefs, remember when they got destroyed by the Buccaneers in the Super Bowl? Their offensive line got Pat Mahomes rattled, and obviously it was a bad performance from him in that offense in that game. Remember how they rebuilt that offensive line the next offseason?
Yep.
They traded a first-round pick for Orlando Brown. They signed Joe Thuney in free agency to a big money contract. They draft Creed Humphrey in round 2. They waited for him. They didn't take him round 1. Remember, there was a lot of talk that Creed Humphrey could be a round 1 pick. They took him in round 2. Then they took a calculated risk on Trey Smith, the right guard, later in that draft. Those are 4 of their 5 starters on the offensive line right now. I defy most people to be able to tell me who their starting right tackle is because it's no longer Mitchell Schwartz.
Is it Andrew Wiley?
So you look at,
I think it's Wiley.
There you go. Cody wins. Cody wins the contest today. So look at, I think that the Chiefs are an example of that. The Cincinnati Bengals as well. They didn't just go out and throw their top picks at the offensive line. Even after last year, remember the Bengals took a DB out of Michigan in the first round of this year's draft. So look, the Broncos have a number of ways you can go about this. There's no one right way to go about rebuilding the offensive line. And I would argue that maybe veteran guys are the more preferable option at this point. Like it could be that Dalton Risner coming back with maybe Mike Munchak coming back to coach the offensive line or anybody other than Butch Berry. Maybe that's a better option than just throwing a draft pick at somebody, right? Because you don't know how a rookie is going to perform. And you have a quarterback in Russell Wilson that you can't necessarily risk the, unpredictability of a rookie going through rookie growing pains. Now, there's some rookies that will hit. There's some rookies that won't. But I just think one way or the other, what do the Broncos need on the offensive line? Consistency and availability. And those two things have been very low supply in Denver for regardless of position, it seems, lately. But I think those are the two things they primarily need. Whether they get it through the draft, trades, free agency, what have you, that remains to be seen. But I don't think Broncos fans should marry themselves to this idea that it's the draft or bust to rebuild the O-line.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point too, right? Because one of the things I look at specifically, look at Luke Wattenberg, right? He's a guy who played 5 years at Washington. He's a guy who has a lot of football experience. He came in and got thrown into the fire in the NFL, and he struggled at center. He struggled at guard. And, granted, he had some tough matchups, right? It's a tough ask for a rookie, but you want to see guys respond. And so you talk about, if you throw a young guy in too soon when he's not ready, we worry about the things where his confidence can be impacted. And look, when you lose your confidence, it's evident on the football field. I think in the first half against Kansas City, look at Alberto, for example. You could tell his confidence has been shot this season because of the coaching decisions and the fact that, he came in and then he had a couple of drops, but then he just rebounded. You need confidence builders with this. Now, I'll also point this out. It's not often, right, especially in the offensive tackle position, if somebody's hitting free agency and a team's letting them, there's a good reason. I think we all learned our lesson from the Juwan James standpoint from the Broncos, right? I think that's a great example. Now, granted, it's something that burnt Denver in the past, and you can't always be afraid to take risks. But you have to be calculated, as you mentioned earlier. If somebody is hitting free agency as an offensive tackle, there's a reason why, right? And then the offensive line, there's a reason why. Now, everything could be changing when you have an identity. Okay, you know what offensive scheme you're going to run. You know what run blocking scheme you're going to run. You have a coach in place. That, to me, I think will give you a little bit more clarity, but I agree with you. I think that you have to be very smart, right? And you can still invest in maybe the future at that position and bring them along slowly, specifically at right tackle. And unfortunately, Sayre, the Broncos aren't going to be in a position, offensive line-wise, to get some of the premier tackles in the NFL draft. Those guys are probably going to go anywhere between, top 10, top 20. Denver's going to be probably at 28, potentially 31. You never know how it may end here, obviously with the NFL playoffs coming up. So I do think that is something that fans absolutely have to consider. What do we think the team will do? I think they'll be very calculated in the risks and the moves that they make regarding the offensive line here this upcoming season. Just want to say thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in. That'll wrap up today's episode of Locked On Broncos, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you watch us on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, do us a favor, hit that like button and also comment for the algorithm so this video and this channel gets pushed out to more members in Broncos Country. If you're listening to your favorite audio podcasting platform, make sure you leave us a review. We always love your feedback. Tell us why you tune in every single day. Leave your Twitter handle in the review, and any future giveaway we do will be automatically entered for you because of the fact that you did just that. With that said, Sayre and I will be back tomorrow for a brand new episode of the show. The Broncos back at it in their final week of the 2022 NFL season. You know we're here in 2023. Chargers week is here. Can the Broncos end the year with a big-time win against a team that is going into the playoffs? Big things at stake here for Denver this week from a standpoint of perception going into the offseason. We appreciate you so much. We'll be back tomorrow with a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.